She was 34 years old. The autumn the last of her family's land was taken from her, and she stood on the porch of a house that was no longer hers with $11 folded into a handkerchief and nothing else to her name. It was her late husband's brother, Silas Tandy, who cast her out, claiming the deed had always been meant to pass to him, and not to a widow with no sons to work it, and the county clerk, cowed by the Tandy name, and the debts the bank held over half the valley, did not argue. So it was that Eleanor Tandy walked down from Persimmon Ridge with her handkerchief of coins, a canvas grip of clothes, and her red hound Copper trotting faithful at her heel, and came into the town of Millbrook Hollow, Missouri, in the raw gold light of October 1889, looking for anywhere a roof might be bought cheap. She found, in a weed-choked lot behind the old feed store, a forgotten cider press some 30 years dead, its oak beams silvered with weather, and a lean-to shed leaning with it, and when the feed store man said he'd take $3 just to see it hauled off his property, she paid him before she could talk herself out of it. She did not know, as she signed her name to that flimsy bill of sale, that the press had a secret sealed beneath its floor, that would take half a county's worth of shame and grief and turn it, at last, toward the light. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Tandy and her faithful dog Copper. If this story finds you in a season of your own, some quiet foolish leap of faith, some cheap forgotten thing you couldn't walk past, we hope you'll tell us about it in the comments below, because we believe the smallest purchases sometimes carry the largest mercies. Eleanor had not always been a woman without a name of her own. She had been born Eleanor Vance in 1855 on a modest farm outside Millbrook Hollow, the third of 5 children to a cooper and his wife, a family that made its living building barrels for the very orchards that ringed the hollow like a green collar. Her father, Amos Vance, was a patient man who believed that a barrel built badly was a lie told to whoever trusted it with their cider or their flour, and he raised his children on that single conviction, hammered so often into their evenings that Eleanor could recite it before she could write her letters. Build it true, or don't build it at all. From him she learned the grain of wood, how to read a stave for weakness, how to steam and bend and true a hoop until it held. From her mother, Judith, a woman who kept the family's small orchard of winesaps and Baldwins with the same unforgiving discipline, she learned the slower art of patience, how a tree wanted years, not seasons, and how a person who wanted to eat come February had better have put something by in September. It was, Eleanor would later say, the best education a girl in the Ozark Hill Country could have received, though it came with no schoolhouse, and no diploma, only calloused hands, and a habit of looking hard at things before deciding what they were worth. She met Daniel Tandy at 17, at a harvest dance, held in the same feed store lot, where, years later, she would come to buy her cider press, though of course, she could not have known that then. Daniel was the younger son of a respected Millbrook family, a quiet, sturdy young man with an orchard of his own, inherited from an uncle, and he did not court her with flattery so much as with an evident seriousness. He asked her opinion on grafting stock, on drainage, on whether a north slope orchard would fruit later than a south one, and treated her answers as though they mattered, which in that country and that century was itself a kind of romance. They married in 1874, and for a decade and more, they built a life together on the Tandy orchard above Persimmon Ridge, raising apples and a little stock, weathering the lean years, and the good ones with the same steady hand her father had taught her to bring to everything. It was in the spring of 1881 that Eleanor found the dog. She had gone down to the creek bottom below the orchard to check a fence line after a hard rain and heard, from beneath a fallen sycamore, a thin and desperate whimpering. She dug with her bare hands through mud and root until she uncovered a half-drowned pup, red-coated, ribs showing through matted fur, alone with no mother or litter mate anywhere to be found, as though he had simply washed down from some farm upstream in the flood. She wrapped him in her apron and carried him the better part of a mile home, and Daniel, watching her sit up 3 nights running to feed the pup warm milk from a rag, said she'd named him before she knew she had. She kept calling him her little copper penny, for the bright color of his coat, and copper he became, and copper he stayed. He grew into a rangy, deep-chested hound, with an extraordinary nose, and an even more extraordinary loyalty. The kind of dog who slept across the threshold of whatever room Eleanor occupied, as though he had personally appointed himself her only sentry. In the years that followed, as she and Daniel tried and failed to bring a child safely into the world, twice, and both times, grief nearly broke her. It was Copper who lay his heavy head in her lap through the worst of those nights, who seemed to understand, in the way that good dogs do, that his job was simply to be present. Daniel used to say that Copper had more sense than half the men in the valley, and Eleanor, though she laughed it off, privately believed it to be true. There was, too, a particular autumn evening in 1884 that Eleanor would return to often in memory in the hard years ahead. She and Daniel had brought in a good harvest that season, and after the last bushel was carried to the cellar, they sat together on the porch step in the blue dusk, while Copper, still young enough to be foolish, chased fireflies through the yard, with a joy so total and unself-conscious that Eleanor laughed until her sides ached. The first easy laughter she had managed since losing her second child that spring. Daniel had reached over and taken her hand and said, without any particular ceremony, that a woman who could laugh like that after a winter like the one they'd had, was the truest thing he'd ever built his life around, truer than any orchard. Copper had come and laid his damp head across both their joined hands, as though sealing the moment with his own quiet blessing, and it was a picture Eleanor carried with her, whole and unbroken, through every difficulty that followed. Proof, she told herself later, that joy and hardship could occupy the same modest porch, the same modest life, without either one canceling out the other. The values she carried into her marriage were, then, the same ones her parents had given her. Build it true, tend what you're given with patience, and do not mistake a hard season for a broken one. She had no way of knowing how thoroughly those convictions would be tested, nor how long it would be before she needed every one of them simply to survive. The fall began, as these things so often do, with a debt that was never truly hers. In 1886, Daniel had borrowed $400 from the Millbrook Farmers Bank to replant a stretch of orchard blighted by canker, putting up the land itself as security, as half the orchardmen in the hollow had done at one time or another with the bank's obliging cashier, a broad soft-spoken man named Ezra Colt. Colt's family had run the bank for 2 generations, and the Colts had, in that time, quietly acquired an uncomfortable amount of the good bottomland in the valley, through notes that came due at inconvenient seasons, and were called in without much patience. Daniel died of a fever in the winter of 1888, not yet 50, and left Eleanor a widow with a mortgage still owed, and a brother-in-law, Silas, who had long resented that the better orchard had gone to his younger brother, and not to himself. Silas moved quickly. He went to Ezra Colt within the month, and arranged, with a great show of family duty, to assume the note himself, and thereby the deed, presenting Eleanor with papers that made her occupancy of her own house a matter of his charity, rather than her right. She fought it as best she could. She rode into town, and sat in the county clerk's office, and asked to see the original filing, and the clerk, a nervous young man named Purdy, who owed his position to Colt's good word, told her the file appeared to be in order, though he would not quite meet her eye when he said it. She had no money for a lawyer, and no family left to stand behind her. Her own parents had passed, her siblings scattered to Kansas and beyond. By September of 1889, Silas had given her 30 days to vacate what had been her home for 15 years, and in those 30 days, Eleanor learned a particular arithmetic of grief. How many possessions could be sold, how many could be carried, and how very small the remainder was once the 2 columns were subtracted against each other. She sold the milk cow and the good rocking chair her mother had left her. She sold Daniel's tools to a neighbor, who at least had the decency to look ashamed while he counted out the coins. She kept only what would fit in one canvas grip, and the handkerchief of savings that amounted, in the end, to $11.40. On the last morning, standing in the doorway of the house where she had buried 2 children in the orchard's far corner, and nursed a husband through his final fever, she felt copper press his full weight against her leg, steady and warm. The one thing in the world that had not been sold, mortgaged, or taken by a man with a signature and a grudge. When the 30 days ended, she walked out with her handkerchief of coins, her grip of clothes, and copper, and did not look back, because she had learned young, that looking back at a burning barn never put out the fire. It was in this raw and friendless state that she came into Millbrook Hollow proper, a woman past the first flush of youth, with no husband, no property, and a small dwindling sum that would not stretch through a Missouri winter unless she found shelter fast and found it cheap. She took a single room above the dry goods store, on credit against future work, mending and taking in wash, and it was on her second day of walking the town, looking for any means of earning steadier bread, that she wandered behind the feed store, and saw the cider press. It sat half swallowed by ironweed and blackberry cane, a great old beast of oak and iron, that had clearly once been the pride of somebody's orchard operation, a proper community screw press, the kind 3 or 4 farms might have shared in the days before every man owned his own, with a lean-to built around it, that had long since lost half its shingles to weather. Feed store man Orrin Fitch, sweeping his loading dock, told her it had sat there since old Thomas Bellwether died some 8 years back, and nobody in the family wanted it, and if she had $3 and a way to move it, she was welcome to it, and good riddance, since it was taking up space he wanted for a new grain bin. Eleanor had grown up around presses like it. Her father had built barrels for a dozen just such rigs, and something in her, some stubborn cussedness that had survived Silas, and the bank, and the long walk down from Persimmon Ridge, said that a woman who understood wood and cider and patience could make a living from a press, even if she owned nothing else in the world. She counted out $3 silver into Orrin Fitch's palm before her good sense could talk her out of it, and Fitch, laughing not unkindly, said she'd bought herself a whole lot of rotten lumber and a headache, and wished her well of it. That first evening, with a borrowed lantern, and copper sniffing eagerly at every corner of the lean-to, she began to take stock of what $3 had actually purchased. The press itself was sound enough at its heart. The great oak screw was cracked, but not broken. The basin solid, though the whole apparatus wanted cleaning and oiling, and a new set of staves for the collection trough. It was while she was running her hand along the base timbers, checking them the way her father had taught her to check any wood before trusting it, that she noticed Copper had gone very still at the northeast corner of the shed, nose down, tail low and quivering, making a low continuous sound in his throat that she had heard from him only twice before in his life, once when a rattlesnake had coiled unseen beneath the porch steps, and once the night before Daniel's fever finally broke him. It was not a bark, it was something more like a question he could not otherwise ask. She knelt beside him in the lantern light, and saw that the floorboards beneath the press's northeast leg were not in fact laid the same way as the rest of the shed floor. They ran crosswise where the others ran the length of the building, and the nail heads were of an older hand-forged pattern than those elsewhere. Copper would not be called off it, scratching now with real purpose at the seam between 2 boards, and when Eleanor finally worked her fingers into that seam and pried, one board came up clean in her hand, revealing not dirt beneath but a second layer of planking, deliberately laid, deliberately hidden, and beneath that, when she had pulled up enough boards to see, the black square mouth of a stairway leading down into the earth. She did not go down that first night. She was a sensible woman, and a sensible woman does not descend into an unknown cellar alone after dark, with only a hound and a borrowed lantern low on oil, however loudly her curiosity argued otherwise. She boarded the opening back over as best she could, latched the shed, and walked back to her rented room above the dry goods store, with her heart going harder than it had any right to over a hole in a dirt floor, and Copper walked so close against her leg the whole way, that she nearly tripped over him twice. She returned the next morning with a full lantern, a crowbar, and a length of rope, and Copper went down the narrow earthen stairs ahead of her, as though he had done it 100 times, tail wagging low and steady, entirely without fear, which gave her more courage than she likely would have found alone. The cellar beneath the cider press was small, dry, and lined with fieldstone, clearly built with care, rather than dug in haste, and it took her eyes some moments in the lantern light to understand what she was looking at. A single sturdy strongbox of iron-bound oak, and stacked beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a great many rolled papers. The papers, when she carried them up into the daylight and began, with trembling hands, to unroll them, proved to be deeds, dozens of them, old survey plats and land patents dating back to the 1850s and 1860s, bearing names she recognized from every farm in the hollow, Bellwether, Fitch, Marsh, Colt, Tandy among them, her own late husband's family included. Tucked among the deeds was a ledger book, its leather cover soft with handling, filled in a careful, patient hand she did not recognize, but would soon come to know as Thomas Bellwether's own. It took her the better part of that first day, sitting cross-legged on the shed floor with Copper's head heavy across her knee, to understand what the ledger recorded, and when she did understand it, she sat very still for a long while, with her hand pressed to her mouth. Thomas Bellwether, she learned from the ledger's patient entries, had been more than the town's old cider man. In the years following the war, when the Hollow's farmers were rebuilding on borrowed money and thin credit, Bellwether had served as the informal registrar of a farmers' cooperative, a mutual arrangement in which a dozen families pooled resources to buy seed, share equipment, and most crucially, to hold their original land patents together in a common strongbox, as protection against exactly the kind of quiet manipulation that had cost Eleanor her own home. The cooperative's founding charter, copied in Bellwether's hand at the front of the ledger, established that no member family's land could be foreclosed or transferred without the patent itself being produced and verified against the cooperative's registry. A safeguard, the charter explained in blunt plain language, against bankers who might be tempted to process papers on land they had never truly held title to secure. And there, dated 1871, was an entry that made Eleanor's breath catch. A notation in Bellwether's hand, recording that the elder Ezra Colt, grandfather to the banker who now controlled half the valley's mortgages, had approached the cooperative demanding the patents be surrendered to the bank for safekeeping, and that Bellwether, suspecting the bank meant to quietly refile competing claims against cooperative land during a period of confused post-war record-keeping, had refused, and had instead built this hidden cellar beneath his own cider press to keep the true patents safe, telling no one but his wife where they lay. He had meant, the ledger's final entries made clear, to reveal the cooperative and its purpose openly, once the county's land office had stabilized and the risk had passed. But he had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1881 before he ever did so, and his widow, not fully understanding what the cellar held, had simply let the press stand forgotten until her own death, and the property had passed out of the family's hands to Orrin Fitch's father, and then to Orrin himself, none of them ever suspecting what lay beneath their feet. Eleanor understood, sitting there with Bellwether's ledger open across her lap, and dust motes turning gold in a shaft of afternoon light through the shed's broken shingles, that she was holding proof that the current deed to her own Tandy orchard, the very deed Silas and Ezra Colt's grandson had used to cast her out, very likely did not match the original patent that Bellwether had sealed away in this cellar for safekeeping nearly 2 decades before. If the cooperative's charter held any legal weight, and if the patents in that strongbox matched what the ledger claimed, then a great many transactions the Colt Bank had processed over the years, including the one that had taken her own home, might be built on sand. She did not act rashly. She had learned, in 15 years of marriage and a decade of hard seasons, that a claim made too loudly and too soon could be buried again by men with more money and more friends in the courthouse than she had. So she spent the better part of 2 weeks quietly restoring the cider press to working order by day, earning small honest money pressing cider for townsfolk who brought her bushels of windfall apples, and slowly, patiently, letting the whole town see a widow making an honest living from a forgotten press, while by night she copied every deed, transcribed the ledger's key entries into her own hand for safekeeping in a second location, and rode twice to the county seat in Springfield, to consult, discreetly, with an old land office clerk her father had once built barrels for, a Mr. Aloysius Greer, now retired, but still sharp as a new forged blade, who confirmed to her, after close study of the survey markings, that the patents in her strongbox bore the county's original 1850s seal, and predated by years the paperwork the Colt Bank currently held on file for several hollow properties. She might have stopped there, satisfied with the deeds alone, had Copper not returned to the cellar a second time, 3 days into her study of the ledger, and begun scratching with the same low insistence at a loose fieldstone near the base of the far wall, a stone she had walked past a dozen times without a second glance. Curious now in a way that outpaced her caution, she pried at it until it shifted, and behind it found a small tin box, rusted at the seams, holding a single folded letter in a woman's hand. Bellwether's wife, Mercy, had written it in the last winter of her own life, addressed to whoever might one day find what her husband had hidden, explaining in plain frightened script that she had never fully understood the legal weight of what lay in the strongbox, but had known enough to fear the Colt name, and begging whoever read her words to see that the cooperative families got what was rightfully theirs before the bank's memory of the matter grew any more convenient. It was this letter, more than the ledger itself, that steadied Eleanor's resolve in the difficult weeks to come, for it told her plainly that she was not merely settling her own account, but finishing a task 2 people had died without seeing through, and that Copper, sniffing out first a hidden stairway and then a hidden stone, had in effect finished what Mercy Bellwether could not. It was Copper, in those quiet weeks, who first alerted her that she was being watched. 3 separate nights, he woke her with a low growl, directed at the shed's rear window, and on the 3rd night, she rose, and, through a gap in the boards, saw a lantern moving away down the lane toward town, toward, she was nearly certain, the direction of the Colt house. She understood then that word of her cider press's unexpected productivity, or perhaps simply of her visits to the old county clerk, had reached ears she would rather it hadn't, and that the time for quiet patience was drawing to a close. Ezra Colt came to her himself on a gray November morning, dressed in his good coat, all soft-spoken concern, offering to buy the cider press property outright, for $50. A sum so far beyond its evident worth, that only a fool would have failed to understand it as an attempt to bury something rather than acquire it. When Eleanor declined, politely but plainly, his manner cooled by degrees, and he reminded her, with the particular gentleness men like him used when they meant a threat, that a woman alone with debts to the dry goods store, and no clear standing in the county, could find herself with fewer friends than she supposed come winter. She told him she would think on his offer, and watched him ride away, and that same evening, Silas Tandy appeared at her shed door as well, red-faced and blustering, accusing her of trying to stir up trouble that would embarrass the family name, and threatening to have her run out of Millbrook Hollow entirely, if she did not drop whatever foolishness she was chasing. Copper did not growl at Ezra Colt, who kept his hands folded, and his voice mild even in threat, but at Silas, whose voice rose, and whose hand came up in a gesture that might, in another moment, have become a blow. Copper placed himself bodily between the man and Eleanor, hackles raised, a sound coming from his chest, that made Silas step back onto the lane, and think better of whatever he'd intended. It was the first and only time in all his gentle years, that Copper showed his teeth to any person, and Eleanor understood it as confirmation of everything she had already come to believe. That the men arrayed against her were not merely protecting a family reputation, but guarding a fraud old enough to have grown comfortable with itself. Word of the trouble spread through Millbrook Hollow faster than Eleanor would have liked, as such things always do in small towns, and she felt the change in how people met her eye at the dry goods store. Some looked away entirely, mindful of the bank's good graces, while others, farmers who had themselves felt the pinch of a note called in too soon, began to linger near her stall at the press with questions that were not really about cider at all. Orrin Fitch's wife warned her, not unkindly, that Ezra Colt had been seen twice that week in conversation with the county sheriff, a Colt cousin by marriage, and that a woman with no husband, and no deed of her own standing, could find herself accused of trespass or theft on property she no longer technically owned, if the bank decided to move against her before the matter ever reached a judge. Eleanor understood the warning for what it was, and spent one sleepless night, seriously weighing whether to hide the strongbox again, and disappear west as her own siblings had, before deciding, with Copper's steady breathing at her feet, the only sound in the dark room, that she had already lost a home once, to men who counted on frightened women staying quiet, and she would not lose this chance the same way. She spent that week gathering what allies she could, quietly and carefully, calling first on the widow of Thomas Bellwether's own nephew, a woman named Ruth Marsh, whose family's deed appeared in the cooperative's registry, and then on Orrin Fitch himself, who was startled nearly speechless to learn what had lain beneath a shed he'd sold for $3, and finally on old Mr. Greer, who agreed, for the sake of an honest county record, and an old friendship with her late father, to accompany her to Springfield, and present the cooperative's charter and the recovered patents formally before the circuit judge. It was a slim chance, built on documents decades old, and the word of a widow with no standing, against a bank with 2 generations of friends in every courthouse in the county. But Eleanor had learned patience from an orchard, and true building from a cooper's bench, and she did not intend to let either lesson go to waste now that it mattered most. The hearing was set for a bitter cold morning in December, in the Springfield courthouse, before Judge Everett Marsh, who bore no relation to Ruth Marsh, but shared, by good fortune, her family's long memory of the valley's older history. Ezra Colt arrived with his own lawyer, and a stack of the bank's current filings, plainly expecting the matter to be dismissed, as the desperate grasping of a woman with nothing left to lose. What he had not expected was Aloysius Greer rising, in his slow deliberate way, to lay Thomas Bellwether's original ledger and its founding charter before the bench, followed by the cooperative's patents themselves, their seals verified against the county's own oldest survey books, which Greer had thought to have fetched up from the archive the day before. The charter's plain language proved the crux of it. No cooperative member's land could be lawfully transferred without the original patent being produced, and the original patents, it was now shown beyond dispute, had never left Bellwether's hidden cellar until Eleanor herself brought them into the light. Judge Marsh, reading through the ledger's careful entries with a deepening frown, asked Ezra Colt directly whether the bank's current filings on several hollow properties, Tandy Land among them, had ever been cross-checked against these original patents, and Colt, for the first time in the proceeding, had no ready answer. The judge ordered a full review of the disputed transfers, and in the weeks that followed, as Greer and a county surveyor worked through the old records methodically, it became clear that at least 6 families in Millbrook Hollow, including Eleanor's own, held claim to land the Colt Bank had improperly transferred, refiled, or foreclosed upon over the better part of 2 decades, always by exploiting the very confusion the cooperative's charter had been built to prevent. The restoration that followed was not swift, and Eleanor was careful, at every step, to insist that it be about more than her own house. She stood before the assembled families of the cooperative, the Marshes and the Fitches and 3 others besides her own, in the very shed that had held the secret for 8 silent years, and read them Bellwether's charter aloud in full, reminding them that the old man's purpose had never been personal gain, but mutual protection, and that whatever came of the hearing ought to be shared according to that same spirit, rather than seized by whoever moved quickest. Her own Tandy orchard was restored to her by the Circuit Court's order in the spring of 1890, the transfer to Silas voided for want of a valid patent, and Silas, humiliated before the town and stripped of the leverage he'd built his standing on, left the hollow within the year for his wife's people in Arkansas, and was seen there no more. Ezra Colt was permitted to keep his position at the bank, the court finding no proof he had personally falsified the original documents, though the elder fraud his grandfather had begun was laid bare enough that the bank's board, mindful of its reputation with every family in the valley now watching closely, quietly removed him from any authority over land transactions within the year, and he lived out his days a diminished, watched man in a town that no longer extended him easy trust. Eleanor kept the cider press. She restored the shed properly that following summer, re-roofed and re-timbered by Orrin Fitch himself, as a kind of penance and gratitude both, and turned the old community screw press back into precisely what Thomas Bellwether had always meant a cooperative press to be. A place where the Hollows farm families brought their windfall and their pressing apples each fall, sharing labor and the sweet result of it, a tradition that continued long after Eleanor herself had gone gray, and one which the town came, in time, to call simply Bellwether's Press, in honor of the man whose quiet, careful patience had waited 8 years underground for someone worthy to find it. It is worth remembering, at the last, that Eleanor Tandy came into Millbrook Hollow with $11, a canvas grip, and a dog, and that she spent $3 of those dollars on a rotten old press that half the town considered a joke and a headache in equal measure. She could not have known, standing in Orrin Fitch's weed-choked lot with her coins counted out into his palm, that she was buying not lumber and iron, but the restoration of a whole hollow's quiet, unrepaid debt to an honest man's memory. Nor could she have known that the surest guide to that restoration would be a red hound she had once pulled half-drowned from a flooded creek bottom, who repaid that long-ago rescue by leading her, nose down and unafraid, straight to the one secret in Millbrook Hollow worth finding. It is the same lesson her father tried to teach her over a cooper's bench years before, that the worth of a thing is very often hidden beneath its surface, and that it takes a patient eye, a true hand, and sometimes simply a faithful heart low to the ground, to find what has been waiting all along to be seen. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Eleanor and her faithful copper. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that even the smallest, cheapest, most overlooked things can hold within them the means of setting an old wrong right. We leave you with this question to turn over on your own porch tonight. What forgotten thing in your own life might be waiting, quietly, to be looked at more closely? Until next time, stay close.